For centuries and generations, the sport of thoroughbred horse racing has pulsated through the fabric of our culture, representing symbols of affluence and aristocracy since the early days of King Charles II of England, who opted to bring his reign and sport of kings to his North American possessions. Fast forward to present-day Long Island, New York, where the Queen's Historical Society relied on two major repositories of American horse racing history, the New York Racing Association and the Jockey Club, to create and develop the exhibit, The Sport of Kings and Queens, celebrating 350 years of thoroughbred horse racing.
So 350 years ago, that was 1667, England had just defeated the Netherlands and taken over this area. We're on Long Island, and so there was very little here. It was mainly agriculture, and mostly the Dutch came here as business people, merchants. And coming from New England and the eastern end of Long Island were English settlers. They were farmers, so they needed to eat in what is today New York City. The first officially established track in Queens in North American possessions of Britain was in 1667 in what is now Hempstead, Long Island, but it was part of the county of Queens at the time.
Arguably America's oldest competitive sport, horse racing could be associated with the unbridled strength, servitude, and spirit of champion steeds, and the founding of our country. Certainly, the sport's social and economic dimensions impacted the new nation's first leaders. President George Washington was considered the best horseman of his age and the most graceful figure that could be seen on horseback. A farmer first and statesman second, Washington took immense pride and interest in improving the bloodlines of saddle, work, and racehorses. At the same time, breeding stock from England flowed into Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Kentucky. Thoroughbred breeding stock farms developed in the South, flourishing throughout Kentucky's bluegrass region to make it the world's largest producer of the breed. Two such influencers to promote the sport included William R. Travers, who founded Saratoga Racecourse in upstate Saratoga Springs, New York, and Wall Street stockbroker James R. Keene, whose farm near Lexington, Kentucky, would become one of the world's most important breeding operations. In the late 19th century, the names Belmont, Whitney, and Keene became synonymous with American thoroughbred horse racing excellence, and New York was the place to be. Some champions are born into a legacy. Other champions are born to become legends. From America's heartland came the heartbeats of horsemen whose Nebraska upbringings helped create the recipe for their national success. The legendary work ethic and horsemanship of National Hall of Fame trainers John Nerud, Marion van Berg, and his son Jack van Berg were built first out of sheer necessity from their scrappy upbringings in the Central Plains and Sand Hills of Nebraska, and secondly, by their rogue spirits, pure grit, and instinctive nature.
The Nebraska upbringing for my father was extremely important because it taught him the work ethic it took, the hard winters, the hot summers, and he, through his grandfather, learned that work ethic from an early age. And so there wasn't a person on the backside that I saw work harder than my father.
Well, part of his success was from where he came from. And he was very proud of the fact that he came from Nebraska.
In Uncle Johnny, there was this love of horses and competition. It was in his blood, horses and racing. My Uncle Johnny was something special.
Known as champions of the backstretch, these native Nebraskans became champions of some of America's most prestigious thoroughbred racing winners' circles, leaving an undeniable and remarkable national legacy in America's oldest sport. From the unlikeliest of places, Nebraska proved to be the breeding ground of its own Triple Crown legacy, although Marion van Berg, Jack Van Berg and John Nerud may no longer be here. Their legacy lives on in the record books and in the hearts of racing fans everywhere. From humble horsemen to racing royalty, these thoroughbred champions were born to reign. In the span of a century, only 13 horses, along with their trainers and owners, have ever made it to the coveted winner's circles of all 3 qualifying races that make up thoroughbred horse racing's Triple Crown. For all 13, it's been an unsurmountable dream come true. But for the first one, it was never even supposed to happen. In 1919, a 3-year-old chestnut thoroughbred horse named Sir Barton swept the Kentucky Derby, Preakness, and Belmont Stakes races. However, it wasn't until 1950 when the Thoroughbred Racing Association in New York looked back in the records and officially acknowledged Sir Barton's accomplishment 31 years earlier. Sir Barton was retroactively documented as America's first Triple Crown winner. Sir Barton was trained as a pacemaker for his stablemate Billy Kelly and wasn't expected to win his maiden race at the Kentucky Derby on Saturday, May 10, 1919, or any of the subsequent races that followed. But the well-bred colt, foaled at John E. Madden's Hamburg Place near Lexington, Kentucky, did what he was bred to do. He won. The prestige, notoriety, and fanfare that come with winning thoroughbred horse racing's holy grail was recently celebrated for only the 13th time after Justify won the 2018 Belmont Stakes, the 3rd and final race of the Triple Crown series. So one may wonder how America's first Triple Crown winner, Sir Barton, who was foaled in Kentucky, sold in New York, could have ever ended up as part of Douglas, Wyoming's history. Sir Barton's journey from his birthplace in Kentucky to his final resting place in Wyoming begins 40 years before his death in 1937. The time was September 1897, near the same period that Manhattan, Staten Island, and the boroughs of Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Queens officially became New York City. The place was Sheepshead Bay Racecourse, home of the Coney Island Jockey Club in Brooklyn, America's mecca for horse racing. The New York Times reported all the horse race results of the day, attracting attention to the rich and famous, and a 50-year-old inventor, Thomas Edison, with his new motion picture camera. Drawing a crowd to Sheepshead Bay Racecourse on a scorching Saturday afternoon, that September 11th in 1897, was a 2-year-old robust bay colt named Hamburg. Born with a broad blaze and 2 hind stockings, Hamburg, the son of leading sire Hanover, was foaled in 1895 on the lush Elmendorf farm near Lexington, Kentucky. He had been purchased as a weanling by John E. Madden for $1,200. With Madden's training, Hamburg won 12 races in 16 starts and was on a campaign to become the 2-year-old horse of the year. "Young man, do you own that colt?" asked Marcus Daly of the 40-year-old John Madden, inquiring about Hamburg, who had just won a decisive victory in the Great Eastern Handicap. Daly, the great Copper King magnate of Montana and one of the wealthiest men in the country, was sparing no expense to build a bloodline for his stock farm in the Bitterroot Valley near Hamilton, Montana. His Montana homebred Scottish chieftain had just won the 1897 Belmont Stakes a few months earlier that year, and to this day remains the only Montana-bred horse to ever have won the race. The stocky, likable, and gregarious Irishman pressed Madden further. "What's your price?" John Madden was attending to Hamburg's ankles and not showing Daly's questions any interest until just the right moment. Living by the adage, "Better to sell and repent than keep and regret," Madden finally yelled over his shoulder back at Daly, $50,000! $50,000! It wasn't exactly the most arbitrary number for the likes of Daly to hear. In fact, Daly's friend and copper mining business investor James B. Hagan was one of the leading thoroughbred breeders in the country at the time, and he had just purchased Elmendorf Farm, where Hamburg was foaled. But no horse on record had ever been sold for more than $40,000. After a few months of negotiating with Madden, Marcus Daly was ready to make the most historic purchase for a horse in thoroughbred racing history, paying $40,001, just $1 more to beat the record. Daly was now the proud owner of Hamburg. Quite a remarkable American dream story, considering that Daly had arrived at the New York harbor from Ireland just 40 years earlier at age 15. From a newsboy on the streets of New York City, Daly now owned the most expensive horse in America, and the sale of Hamburg would influence the course of thoroughbred racing history forever. Marcus Daly took Hamburg to his famed trainer William Lakeland at his Brighton Beach Racecourse stables. At the same time, Madden took his record $40,001 straight back to Lexington, Kentucky, to invest in horses and prime bluegrass land. For $30,000, Madden bought 235 acres east of downtown Lexington at Winchester Pike. It was known as the Overton Place, where 19th century Kentucky statesman Henry Clay was said to have been married in the main residence. Now, as the new owner, Madden changed the name to Hamburg Place to honor the 2-year-old horse he sold to Daly. Hamburg Place would become Madden's training haven for the next 30 years and earn him numerous titles, including the Wizard of the Turf. After Hamburg, Madden would produce 7 other champions, and from 1901 through 1903, be named America's leading thoroughbred horse trainer. By 1910, Hamburg Place grew to 2,000 acres, and Madden shifted his focus from training to breeding. Beginning in 1918, and for 11 consecutive years, John Madden would become America's leading breeder, producing 182 stakes winners, 5 winners of the Kentucky Derby, 4 Belmont Stakes winners, and 5 future inductees of the Hall of Fame, including that little chestnut colt that Madden named Sir Barton. From the pairing of the stallion Starshoot and the mare Lady Sterling by Hanover, Sir Barton ran 4 races as a 2-year-old, but never won a race. Madden reportedly sold Sir Barton for $10,000 in 1918 to J.K.L. Ross, a Canadian businessman and naval officer. Sir Barton remained a maiden until winning the 1919 Kentucky Derby. Like his paternal grandsire, the 1893 English Triple Crown champion, Isinglass, Sir Barton would earn his own Triple Crown, the first of America's 13 Triple Crown winners. Western Nebraska was barely settled when Sir Barton won the Triple Crown races back east in 1919. John Andrew Nerud, the 4th child of Frank and Alice Nerud, was already 6 years old, and horses were part of his daily life. John Nerud was born February 9, 1913, on the family homestead north of Lake Minnetonka, near the quadrupoint of where Scotts Bluff, Sioux, Box Butte, and Morrill County, Nebraska meet. John's grandfather, Joseph Nerud, an immigrant of Czech-Polish origin, homesteaded to western Nebraska near Alliance in Box Butte County, after first working as a blacksmith in a livery stable on the eastern side of the state in Lincoln, Nebraska. His father, Frank Rudolph Nerud, was considered an excellent horseman, not only raising and training horses for farming and ranching, but also for horse-drawn manual labor, as he worked irrigation projects in the North Platte Valley. The Frank Nerud family moved to a farm near the town of Minnetonka, while still maintaining the cattle ranch. Young Johnny Nerud, along with his brothers, each received a horse when they were 5 to 6 years old, rounding up cattle and learning from their parents that ranch life was impossibly harsh at times.
My father never forgot Nebraska. He loved that cattle ranch. He loved growing up out there. And he just loved horse racing. He had so much fun. He loved horses and he loved racing.
In the early 1900s, when progressive era reform threatened to destroy thoroughbred horse racing in New York State forever, horse racing at the Scottsbluff County Fairgrounds in Mitchell, Nebraska was just getting started. On October 5, 1910, the Mitchell Fair Association held its first race meet. The tradition would continue for nearly 60 years. In the early days, area high schools let their marching band students out of school to march and play at the horse races over the course of the race meet. Stables and stalls were large enough to accommodate 300 horses, and thousands of spectators gathered in the grandstands and along the rail to cheer on their favorite horses. The horse races in Mitchell brought excitement, entertainment, and made a major economic impact to the community, as well as to the owners, trainers, and jockeys. And it's the place where a 13-year-old Johnny Nerud's dream for becoming a racehorse jockey took root.
He got the bug for horses. Well, the story goes, he was a young man, ended up buying a horse, a racehorse, that planned to race it at the fairgrounds. One day a group of gypsies was coming through town. They saw my father on horseback, and they would strike up a conversation with the farmers or the cattle ranchers, and pretty soon it would roll around to horse racing. You see that horse pulling the wagon? We can beat anything you got with that horse. Well, of course, the horse was a runner. And I remember my father telling me the gypsy rider on the other horse was a jockey, and he was good. And off they went, and as they made the turn, my father got ahead in front, and he couldn't pull away from the horse till he looked down. The other jockey had a hold of his saddle cloth and was pulling the horse back. And basically he got loose from him and he beat him half a length. But that got my father the bug. He wanted to be a jockey, he wanted to get into racing, and he was gone.
Like the racehorses he aimed to ride, life for John Nerud moved quickly. After graduating with the Minutair High School class of 1931, John Nerud's horse racing travels took him far away from the dusty corners of western Nebraska, racing and traveling to tracks in North Dakota, Montana, and even Havana, Cuba. John Nerud was eventually so broke, the only way to get back stateside was to hop on a ship with a load of horses headed to Florida. From Miami, the 26-year-old self-described rogue continued to live by his wits, and, as only John Nerud would say, I was full of hell all the time. The year was 1937. War Admiral had just become America's 4th Triple Crown winner, and young John Nerud arrived in Saratoga Springs, New York by a train car full of horses. Still with no money, he slept in Congress Park.
But he was rubbing horses. He was a groom the first time he got to Saratoga. And the horses would ship from down here, and they would go up by train. Well, the train station's on the other side of the town, quite a ways from the racetrack. So when the train pulled into town, it was like a circus. Here come the horses. And everybody would turn out from the town to see the horses unload. And all the horses would walk off the train, walk all the way through town, over until the racetracks where their barns were. And it was almost like a parade. Everybody turned out to see it because now the race meeting's going to start. And all the rich people are going to come, the Vanderbilts and the Whitneys, and the beginning of the season was leading those horses through town.
The thoroughbred sales were active at Saratoga during race season, and John Nerud earned $1 for every yearling he walked from the railroad station to the sales barn. During this time, the Hollywood production called Saratoga, starring Jean Harlow and Clark Gable, was in town. The movie was about a horse breeder's daughter who falls in love with a bookkeeper. All the background filming took place in Lexington and Louisville, Kentucky, and in Saratoga, New York. Finding himself amongst Hollywood celebrities and some of horse racing's most historic and elite figures at the time, it was John Nerud's Western Nebraska work ethic that got him to the next level. He earned a $20 meal ticket from a warm-hearted cook at the track and a job working with the horses for the wife of Jock Whitney of the famed Whitney family. Mr. Whitney had inherited about $20 million after his father's death and later served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Kingdom and publisher of the New York Herald Tribune. John Nerud was offered a job on the Whitney's Virginia farm, but saw even greener pastures for himself when he found a job on New York's Long Island working in the horse stables at Aqueduct, Belmont, and Jamaica racecourses. For the next 2 years, John Nerud groomed horses and launched his career as a jockey agent, following the circuit to tracks around New England, Florida, and New York. His greatest earnings came when he gained the book of jockey Ted Atkinson. Atkinson was riding such distinguished horses as War Relic and competing against Calumet Farms' Whirlaway, America's 5th Triple Crown winner. Those who knew John Nerud professionally recognized his desire to own and train his own horses. Those who knew him personally say one of his greatest successes came at the age of 28 when he married Charlotte Fitzgerald.
My father rented a room in Winthrop, Massachusetts from, turned out to be my grandmother. And my mother was about as different from my father as night and day. She was very social, and she had that Boston, proper Boston upbringing, you know. And they made a great team. And my father always said, you know, if it wasn't for your mother, I never would have got where I was.
By early 1942, John enlisted in the Navy. He and Charlotte owned 3 horses by then, but sold the mounts before heading to San Diego for John's basic training. After 3 years of his military service in the South Pacific, John and Charlotte left California for Florida. With the encouragement of Charlotte and the love of horse racing still part of his core, the 30-something John Nerud signed on as a stable agent for Wolford Farm. He took over as a trainer for the 26-horse stable in 1948, and under Nerud's direction, Wolford Star Horse Delegate won stake races in Chicago and Florida. From April 1948 until January 1949, Nerud saddled 26 winners his rookie year of training. It was now that the Florida and New York thoroughbred racing sports writers took notice of this seemingly unknown former rodeo rider turned trainer from western Nebraska.
And when you're noticed, you get better owners. You know, and with better owners come better horses. My mother actually stayed pretty close to him. She was pushing him up the ladder. She was very sharp. Today, she would have been a businesswoman.
Yeah, Mrs. Nerud, she was a really classy lady. I think she exuded class, and I think she polished him. You know, he was a little rough around the edges when he first came around, but after Charlotte, then he got comfortable with society people. You know, he wasn't really a big society type guy.
John Nerud may have been far removed from his Nebraska roots at the family homestead, but his upbringing still influenced his demeanor. As Nerud's accomplishments in the industry gained notoriety, so did his infallible reputation for speaking from a platform of truth, honesty, and indisputable conviction. His thoughts, ideas, and mind were razor sharp, and his tongue, well, some say, frank, to a fault.
It had to be the way they were brought up on that ranch. Oh, Grandpa Frank was not one to hear trivia and senseless talk. One thing that I noticed that all the Nerud brothers had in common, all my uncles, was they were bottom line men. If you were talking, you needed to get to the subject, and those guys could sort out fact from fiction real quick. So, brutally honest, but I think that came from their dad, Frank.
And the fact was that at 42 years old, John Nerud was managing dozens of horses, grooms, riders, hot walkers, and foremen, all the way from Florida, Chicago, New England, and looking for more. Nerud made it well known that he would accept horses from any Texan oil millionaire. The call would come from Midland, Texas. John Nerud had attracted the attention of well-known millionaire Ralph Lowe, who had express cars full of horses, including a 2-year-old named Gallant Man. 20 years had passed since a young John Nerud arrived in upstate New York, sleeping on park benches in Saratoga. It was time for the 44-year-old Nerud to assert his talent, years of training, and hard work into Major League horse racing. The year 1957 showcased one of the best crops of 3-year-old thoroughbreds the industry had ever seen. Under the historic twin spires of Churchill Downs, the Nerud-trained Gallant Man faced the likes of Wheatley Stables' Bold Ruler and Calumet Farms' Iron Liege in the 1957 Kentucky Derby. Gallant Man in hand and saving ground to the last 3/8 mile, moved up determinedly in the early stretch, reached the lead between calls and was going stoutly when his rider misjudged the finish, and he could not overtake Iron Liege when back on stride. Gallant Man had lost the Kentucky Derby. What happened on May 4th, 1957 was described as a bad dream come true for Team Gallant Man. Owner Ralph Lowe and trainer John Nerud were shattered by the near-miss loss when jockey Willie Shoemaker admittedly misjudged the 1/16th pole for the finish line. This miscalculation impacted John Nerud's feelings about competing in the Kentucky Derby for years to come. But in the words of Kentucky's first important novelist, James Lane Allen, adversity does not build character, it reveals it. It would have been easy for any young trainer to tuck tail, but not for John Nerud. 6 weeks after losing the first leg of the Triple Crown races at Churchill Downs, John Nerud and Gallant Man made one of the greatest comebacks and lasting records in thoroughbred racing history. Nerud skipped the Preakness Stakes in Baltimore and headed straight back to New York to enter Gallant Man in the 1957 Belmont Stakes, the oldest of the Triple Crown races.
New York was the place to be.
At 1.5 miles in length, the Belmont Stakes is the longest stakes race in America. Following his father's lead in the thoroughbred racing world, August Belmont II sought land on Long Island in 1902 to build the most elaborate racetrack in America. Belmont Park had been at its current location in Elmont, New York since 1905.
It's one of the top tracks in the country. It has been for years. And good horses make good trainers, and good horses make good jockeys. You got to have the horse.
37,000 are in the stands for the 89th running of the Belmont Stakes, the closing event of the Triple Crown Turf Series. Stablemates Bold Nero and Gallant Man lead the parade to the post. Bold Ruler with Eddie Arcaro aboard is front runner and the wagering favorite at 17-20. Bold Nero presses with Gallant Man fourth. Teamed by Lowe Stables, they're also odds-on betting choices, 19-20. Just one little oddity in a memorable race. In the backstretch, it's still Bold Ruler with Nero holding the pace. The pack some 8 lengths back. This is the race that usually points out the champion in the 3-year-old division, and this year is no exception. At 7/16 of a mile, Willie Shoemaker starts Gallant Man on a winning drive that carries him to a runaway 8-length triumph, setting a new record for the track, the stakes, and the distance in America. Bold Ruler, exhausted by the pace, crosses third. Oh, one thing more. Gallant Man's the first Irish bred to win the Belmont. Gallant, indeed.
The Belmont's distance proved too much for the favorite Bold Ruler on June 15, 1957, Willie Shoemaker, once again on board Gallant Man, avenged their Derby performance. Gallant Man dominated the field, winning by 8 lengths and setting a new American record of 2 minutes 26 seconds and 3/5, making Gallant Man the first Irish-bred thoroughbred to ever win the Belmont Stakes. His record would stand for 16 years until 1973, when, ironically, a son of bold ruler, the mighty Secretariat, took it down, and it still stands today. In his own distinctive style and timing, John Nerud had broken the mold within the ranks of the sportive kings. The farm boy from a dusty corner of western Nebraska made his own mark right in the very place where thoroughbred horse racing in North America was founded. And for John Nerud, New York was just the beginning.
I first met John Nerud in about the spring of 1977, and I would say that at that time he was ensconced as a legend in the thoroughbred industry. Perhaps his best days of training had passed, but he had passed that mantle on to his son Jan at that stage, and the stable was still operating and running when I first met him at Belmont Park. He was an old-fashioned man. You can't compare him with anybody else. That wonderful expression about when they made Johnny Nerud, they threw away the mold, could not have been more true. And he always reminded of a stallion that came into the life of Tartan, rough and tumble. John had had a rough and tumble life from his early childhood all the way through. He was never a man that stood on ceremony. He was a very modest man.
From New York to Ocala, Florida, John Nerud made the transition from merely a trainer to head of operations of the new Tartan Farm. With the financial backing of William McKnight, CEO of 3M, John Nerud applied his business acumen and pedigree genius to build a racing and breeding empire. Tartan Farms Foundation sires Intentionally and Rough and Tumble, along with broodmare Aspidistra, eventually led to 103 stake winners for the farm, including the legendary Dr. Fager, whose champion sprint son, Dr. Patches, was one of only 3 horses to ever beat the America's 10th Triple Crown winner, Seattle Slew.
Nobody in the thoroughbred industry would ever not say that they knew of Dr. Fager.
Now, a lot of people know my father from a horse trainer, but the truth is he was a better horse breeder than he was a trainer. He read every book on breeding imaginable going back to the 1800s in England. He knew pedigrees that went back 10 generations after a while. And he came to the realization that if you bred speed to speed, you might get a good horse. And he eventually came up with a horse called Dr. Fager, who was probably the fastest horse who ever lived. For 7 furlongs, he was the fastest animal on earth. And most people do believe he was the fastest horse there ever was. He was huge, and he was big, and he was ornery, but he was a great, great horse.
Dr. Fager was a first full crop on Tartan Farm, from Nerud's pairing of Rough and Tumble and Aspidistra. The big Rosy Bay colt was named after the neurosurgeon Dr. Charles Fager, who saved John Nerud's life after John suffered a near-fatal head injury from a horse riding accident. With John Nerud as his trainer, Dr. Fager, the champion horse, would go on to have the greatest single racing seasons of any horse in the history of the sport. In 1968, at the age of 4, Dr. Fager became the only horse to ever hold 4 American horse racing titles in 1 year. He was named the Horse of the Year, Champion Handicap Horse, Champion Sprinter, and Co-Champion Grass Horse. In his most famous performance, Dr. Fager set a world record of 1 minute 32 seconds and 2/5 for a mile in the Washington Park Handicap while carrying 134 pounds. By 1977, Dr. Fager would become the leading sire in North America.
Tartan Farms' history started out with some very humble pedigrees, and they turned them into major winners, and they went on to be stallions. And I think it is It's reflective of John Nerud's own spirit, a tough, aggressive, athletic, with not a great pedigree, could achieve anything that they want and go on to achieve it over years. And that was the case with the Tartan Farm offspring. Because of their toughness and their durability and their racing ability, they went on to be great stallions, and Fapiano and Cosine and Unbridled are indelible names. They will never be forgotten in the history of thoroughbreds, and to this day they keep popping up in pedigrees everywhere.
For nearly 30 years, John Nerud orchestrated the sire and broodmare bloodlines at Tartan Farms, whose pedigrees can be seen in both the last two Triple Crown winners, American Pharoah and Justify. Nerud's pedigree genius of Dr. Fager to Fapiano to Unbridled led to Empire Maker, American Pharoah's grandsire, while Justify's grandsire, Johannesburg, is out of a mare by Ogaijin, also a Tartan Farm bred. After winning the 12th Triple Crown in 2015, American Pharoah won the Breeders' Cup Classic to become the first horse to achieve the Grand Slam of thoroughbred racing. The Tartan Farm influence in American Pharoah gave Unbridled the honor of 4 generations of Triple Crown race winners. John Nerud, who was 102 years old the day American Pharoah won the Triple Crown title on June 6, 2015, could say that he was alive for all of the first 12 Triple Crown wins. Hall of Fame trainer and 2-time Triple Crown winner, Bob Baffert recalls one of his last conversations with Nerud.
He told me that. He called me, he told me that. I've seen them all, Bob, you know, and so, but he was really, I really enjoyed talking to him, because to me, when I was first getting the business, I heard the name John Nerud. It was like, you know, they said, hey, you need to call John Nerud. He wants to talk to you. And I was like, what am I going to tell him? And so then when American Pharoah ran, he called me up and he said, Bob, are you going to run that horse in the Triple Crown? He just won the Kentucky Derby. He said, yeah, if he's doing really well. He says, you know, he said, don't run him. If you don't think he's doing well, don't run him back. That's an incredible horse. You have something really special there. And I said, well, I'm going to see. So I talked to him a few days later. I called him up and I said, you know what? He's doing really well. I'm going to run him in the Preakness. Okay, that's great. That's a great idea. So after the Preakness, he called me up. He said, Bob, you know, I've told you before, the night before, they're going to blade that track. You've got to get that horse on the rail. They just do it all the big days. So I said I will, and you know, we know what happened there. He got on there and he went, I told him, you just go right to the rail, and he won the race. I talked to him afterwards and he said, boy, that was so exciting to watch, and it's been so long, and really complimented me a lot. And until the very end, he'd call me up and check in on me once in a while. It was love. I couldn't believe how old he was. And so, and he still sounded great on the phone. You know, for him to say, he said, man, I'm so proud of you, the way you handle that horse. I remember I came from the quarter horses, and Wayne Lucas came from the quarter horses, so he called Wayne Lucas the Cowboys. You Cowboys come over here and take over our game. You know, they didn't like that, but he didn't care. He knew that you're a horseman first, and I think he's from the old school.
You know, one of the things that needs to be documented on John Nerud is the fact that he was such a visionary and knew the game inside and out. He could relate to the lowest groom. He knew what every hot walker job was. He tried it all. He trained, he owned, he managed, and he was a jock's agent. He did it all.
D. Wayne Lucas recalls the first time he met John Nerud in 1978.
I was at Santa Anita and I made the decision to leave the quarter horse game. And I had just opened my stable of 4 horses over at Santa Anita. And I was riding my saddle pony down through the barn area. And a gray-haired man said, hey, cowboy. And he stopped me. and he said, I'm going to send you some nice horses. And with that, he just walked off. And I didn't know who the hell he was from. So I rode a little further, and I saw another trainer there, and I asked him, I said, who was that guy? And they said, that's John Nerud. He manages Tartan Stable. And I thought, wow. A little while later, he came to the barn. He said, I'm going to give you some really nice horses. And in that group was Codex, Dr. Patches, Moving Money, Ivy Road. Actually, a couple he owned himself. And we had a great relationship after that. I asked him that one day. I said, John, how come you picked me after we'd, been together a number of years? And he said, I just thought I had an instinct that you'd be okay, that you'd do all right. Of course, he loved the quarter horse game, and he knew I was successful there. There's a lot of good horsemen come out of Nebraska, and it didn't surprise me that he would have that heritage. Well, I think they should recognize that he was an icon in the business. It is something in Nebraskan history that probably should go in the record books, along with Tom Osborne and some other, people that are household words in Nebraska.
Trainers of the stature of Johnny Nerud and D. Wayne Lucas, and a recently deceased colleague of theirs, Leroy Jolly, who trained 2 Kentucky Derby winners. It's often forgotten in sports records because the horse is the horse, and the trainer is the most important part in bringing that horse the triumphs that he deserves. So I can understand why we don't compare great trainers in the same way that we might compare a Babe Ruth or a Reggie Jackson. But these people were as famous in their sphere, and they were household names to a lot of people that followed racing. And I think that Johnny understood that.
Nebraska should be very proud of John Nerud. He came out of the sandhills of Nebraska and went all the way to the top. Not only that, he had integrity, and you did not lie to him. You lied to John Nerud one time, and horses go down the road. He knew what he was doing. He was a great horseman.
John Nerud was instrumental in helping Gainesway farm owner John Gaines develop the idea behind the Breeders' Cup World Championships, which began in 1984. Now, halfway through its 4th decade, the unique international championship event for horse racing has grown into a 2-day event of million-dollar-plus races that often determine annual champions in many racing divisions. In 1989, when the prestigious Breeders' Cup selected Gulfstream Park, Florida as the site for its $10 million World Championship of Thoroughbred horse racing, Florida's Governor Bob Martinez officially proclaimed November 1st, 1989 as John Nerud Day. The proclamation recognized John Nerud for his genius to guide Florida's Tartan Farms to a position of eminence in the racing industry, and credited him for playing a prominent role in the Florida Breeders' Cup Committee. John Nerud was inducted into the National Museum of Horse Racing Hall of Fame in August 1972 at the age of 59. At his 100th birthday celebration, a special ceremony was held at the museum to showcase the John A. Nerud collection in the Peter McBean Gallery. Today, a copy of John Nerud's Nebraska Hall of Fame plaque is on display within the Van Berg Racing Collection inside the concourse at Fauner Park in Grand Island, Nebraska. With their plaques immortalized next to each other in the Nebraska Racing Hall of Fame, it becomes clear to any observant onlooker that the Nerud and Van Berg influence in thoroughbred racing extended beyond their home state borders. John Nerud was not the first Nebraskan to be inducted into the National Hall of Fame in Saratoga Springs, New York. Nerud's only predecessor to the National Hall of Fame was horse trainer and owner Marion Van Berg, who was inducted in 1970, just a year before Marion's death at the age of 75. Marion, also known as MH or Mr. Van, was the first Nebraskan to be inducted into the Nebraska Horse Racing Hall of Fame. Marion Van Berg was the nation's leading owner in victories 14 times, including 11 times in a row from 1960 through 1970. He also was the leading money winner owner 4 times, 1965 and 1968, through 1970. This central Nebraska raised farmer turned livestock dealer turned thoroughbred trainer into owner was born in Aurora, Nebraska near Grand Island in 1896. Marion Van Berg was raised during a time when horsepower was still associated with the steeds and draft horses that roamed and plowed furrows on the Great Plains. His father always kept horses and mules for farming and breeding stock. The nearest sale barns to the Van Berg farm were in Grand Island, about 15 miles away. With no stock trucks to haul their livestock, Elwin and his young son Marion's only option was to ride or walk them all the way to Thomas Bradstreet's markets on East 4th Street. Horsemanship and hard work came early in life for young Marion. By 10 years old, Marion made trips to Grand Island with a convoy of mules and horses by himself. At one time, the world's horse buyers, traders, and sellers came to Grand Island. The Burlington Station was built in 1911 and strategically located on 6th and Plum Streets near the markets on 4th Street. Horses were shipped into Grand Island via train from as far-reaching states as Oregon, Washington, Arizona, and New Mexico. Weekly horse sales started at the Grand Island Horse and Mule Market in 1914, and by November 1924, the central Nebraska city became home of the world's largest horse and mule markets. During these days, Marion Van Berg befriended the successful John Washington Torpy, one of the owners of the Grand Island Horse and Mule Market. A Pennsylvania native, Torpy enjoyed a favorable career as a steeplechase jockey before arriving first in Columbus, Nebraska, and transitioning to the horse and cattle buying business. Known as Jack, John Torpy was one of Nebraska's best-known horse and cattle businessmen. Although 26 years older than Marion Van Berg, Torpy was not only a friend, but a mentor to Marion, and encouraged him to open a sales barn in nearby Columbus. Notwithstanding a few struggles in the beginning, Marion opened his new sales barn on March 6, 1936 in Columbus, where it still remains a viable operation by Van Berg family members today. 3 months later, on June 7, 1936, Marion and Viola Van Berg welcomed their 9th child, a boy, whom they named John Charles Van Berg, and affectionately called Jack, to honor their good friend John Torpy. Young Jack was the last of 9 Van Berg children, 7 sisters and 1 brother, and first to be raised in a home with electricity. This new modern convenience didn't mean Jack's life was made easy, as Marion often said, "Idle minds and idle hands make worthless children." Jack's days were spent with his siblings next door at the sales pavilion, where his horse sense developed and shone early.
He had a very early lesson in life from how to work from Grandpa Van. He had a passion for horses that was endless, and he kept pursuing that his whole life.
Marion Van Berg started owning and training thoroughbreds in the 1930s and through the 1940s with the help of a trainer, C.A. Charlie Tanner. As Marion's interest and success in the industry developed, so did young Jack's. Just days after his 16th birthday, Jack accepted a track record trophy in the winner's circle at Omaha's Ak-Sar-Ben for the Van Berg horse, French Admiral, a son of War Admiral, America's 4th Triple Crown winner. Before young Jack joined his father's operation as a trainer, he spent the majority of his teenage years trucking loads of horses to Midwest tracks in Detroit, Chicago, and Omaha. Marion Van Berg banked his reputation and increasing affluence with claiming horses. He even shipped a string of runners cross-country via the Union Pacific Railroad from the yards in Columbus. Marion firmly believed in not racing horses above their class, taking less talented horses and improving them to perform at their best ability. Among his top runners were Rosebed, Knight's Reward, Rose's Gem, Estation, Springbroker, and Grandstand. By the early 1950s, Marion Van Berg captured 2 honors in Nebraska's horse racing circles and was on his way to reaching 2 national leading owner titles. The Van Berg purple and gold silks were becoming so popular in the winter circles from New Orleans to Hot Springs, the Columbus, Nebraska couple were adorned and hailed by their fans as if they were royalty. By his 20th birthday, Jack Van Berg already had lived a lifetime. Jack's failed attempt at college landed him back in Columbus at the family sale barn, this time behind the auction block microphone to learn the art of auctioneering. Based on his father's training mantra, "You'll never learn any younger." The 1960s ushered in a decade of racing dominance for Team Van Berg. When Jack was named deputy trainer and joined Marion's assistant, Bob Irwin, Marion became the first owner in the history of the sport of horse racing to break the record of 200 wins in a single year and earn the most money since the late Warren Wright of Calumet Farm in Lexington, Kentucky. Marion Van Berg's name and royal racing colors became synonymous with earlier master turfmen from Kentucky and New York, like Sir Barton's breeder John E. Madden and trainer Harvey Guy Bedwell. And Jack's accomplishments were adding up too. At the age of 25, Jack received his 3rd straight Ak-Sar-Ben training title in Omaha. While America's first Triple Crown winner, Sir Barton, spent his last days in western Nebraska and Wyoming, America's 3rd Triple Crown winner exhibited the name of Nebraska's largest city, Omaha. Even though the horse had no ties to the state until after he retired, Omaha's owner, William Woodward of New York, once said he named the horse after one of the best towns in these United States. In 1950, the horse was brought to Omaha to be bred to mares in Nebraska City. Eastern Nebraska became one of the premier thoroughbred areas of the Cornhusker State. From Elkhorn to Ashland, Thoroughbred horse farms fed race days at the Ak-Sar-Ben horse track in Omaha. Before the opening of Fauner Park in 1954, the Omaha World Herald named the town of Ashland the horse racing capital of Nebraska. Nestled between the state's 2 largest metropolitan areas, Ashland's horse history dates back to its annual stirrup days.
Jack Van Berg has a reputation in Nebraska. He's been one of the top trainer in Nebraska for many years. Jack won a lot of races, a lot of training titles over the years. And had at that time had horses all over the country. He would fly from Chicago to Omaha about every other day. His father, Marion Van Berg, where Jack got his schooling, of course. I galloped a few horses for Marion Van Berg when I was a young man. Jack set a lot of records that were not broken for a lot of years, and so very good horseman.
If anybody looked at Jack Van Berg, you could just know what kind of individual he was. Very strong, very opinionated man. He was successful. He just exuded that type of, appearance, and it was a great pleasure to have him to visit with him. His opinions were very valuable, and he's obviously a great horseman, just like his father.
From a young man to a seasoned horseman, Jack Van Berg learned and earned the trade of horsemanship from the nation's very best, his own father.
My father, the lasting legacy I think he would want to leave is the horsemanship. There's very few true horsemen around anymore. He wanted to prove the ability to work with horses, communicate with horses, and help them. And if they had a problem, be able to solve that problem for them and make them better and make them healthy and happy. And so he always told me that his father was an incredible horseman and could never compare himself to him. And so I see the same thing with my father. He's such an incredible horseman that I don't know if I'll ever be that level. And hopefully it's a legacy that we can continue in the family going forward.
Before his death in 1971, Marion Van Berg was listed the trainer of record of 1,500 winners with a total record of 4,691 races won and $13,936,965 earned as an owner. No other owner up to that time in the sport of horse racing had ever achieved what Marion Van Berg had on record. Marion was recognized as the first inductee to the Nebraska Racing Hall of Fame, and in 1970, he received one of the highest career honors known in the industry when he became the first Nebraskan ever to be inducted into the National Museum of Racing Hall of Fame in Saratoga Springs, New York. Even today, Marion Van Berg continues to hold the record at Oaklawn Park in Hot Springs, Arkansas, for the most leading owner titles with 8 total racing seasons, 1960, 1963, and 1965 through 1970. From his humble beginning of opening a sales barn during the Depression years in Columbus, Nebraska, to racing throughout the Midwest and holding national racing records that still stand today, Marion Van Berg owned racehorses for 34 years. His assistant, Bob Irwin, was with him for 32 of those years, with his son Jack always nearby training his own string of racers. Upon Marion's death, the Jack Van Berg era of racing in the purple and gold silks began. Jack continued the Van Berg racing stables with the support of his family, close friends, and key employees. He expanded the training operation to multiple locations with assistant trainers and became known as the racing industry's first mobile trainer, flying between his horse racing stables from Detroit, Chicago, New York, Maryland, Louisiana, California, and Kentucky.
To keep a schedule like he did, you have to be able to sleep at a moment's notice and sleep in any place possible. And he could do both those things. He did everything 110%. Even planning his funeral. I mean, he had every detail down that he wanted, and it was going to be his way, to the end. It was, I want it on a Monday or Tuesday, when the major tracks are dark. I want it after January 1st when, people are down here at Oaklawn. I want it before the race meet starts. I want it after training, after 10 o'clock after training, and before feed time. So, the horsemen, I'm not putting them out. And so, that's he planned it all the way to he was going to do it his way, and that's the only way there was.
When Jack Van Berg passed away on December 27, 2017, at the age of 81, after months of battling cancer, the next generation of Team Van Berg racing stables came into place. Jack's longtime training assistant, Sammy Alvarez, and youngest son, Tom Van Berg, continued the Van Berg racing legacy and hold tight to the memories of the man they called mentor, father, and friend.
He's really a larger-than-life figure, and when he comes into a room, everybody takes notice. He's one of those people that people want to be around, and he'll work people harder than they've ever seen. And he'll go out there and lead by example, and the first thing I really learned from him was the amount of work it takes to be successful. And he always told me if you take care of the small details, the larger ones will take care of themselves, and he was always a very detail-oriented person. Always one of the first ones in the barn, always one of the last ones to leave, make sure that everything was exactly right.
I come in 78 and I start work for Jack. And so I like this man, he's a hard hand at the training, and a lot of people still respect. For he's the trainer, it's a good trainer for me. Every day I learn something, for Jack.
In the book written about Jack Van Berg's lifetime achievements, mentoring, dedication, and perseverance, author Chris Katulak, also a fellow Nebraskan, shares stories of trainers like Bill Mott and Wayne Catalano, who developed their skills at the start of their careers from Jack Van Berg University.
When I graduated from high school, I wound up going to Detroit, and I worked for Bob Irwin, who was an ex-Van Berg man. He was, had been raised in Columbus, Nebraska himself. Then at that point, I met Jack Van Berg and got to know him, started galloping a few horses for him. And of course, at that time, the Van Berg team was probably the #1 racing team throughout the Midwest, whether it be Omaha, Chicago, Detroit. They raced around the country. I think the Van Bergs were with Marion and Jack were probably one of the first stables that had multiple locations. And Jack, of course, was on an airplane all the time, flying between one track and another. And I went to work for Jack and worked for him for 3 years. Started out at Oaklawn Park, went up to Chicago, through Omaha. That first year I worked for him, in the fall of the year, he left me at Hawthorne with a few horses and a small group of horses for a couple months. And on to Florida we went, and from there he wanted me to become one of his assistant trainers. He had Frankie Brothers working for him, and he said, I'll give you a job. You and Frankie can both be my assistants. And so I wound up with the Chicago string. That was the year that we set the record, 496 wins. At that time it was a record for the most wins in a single year. The basics are what you learned from your mentor, and that would have been Bob Irwin and Jack Van Berg.
Well, I was very fortunate enough to have a person like Jack Van Berg, who was a Hall of Fame trainer. He's probably one of the best horsemen in the country, and he taught me how to be a horseman. And there's trainers, horsemanship, promoters, and he taught me horsemanship. So I was very grateful for that, and taught me how to be a jockey. I became a jockey before I was a trainer. So I was very successful thanks to Jack Van Berg and teaching me the right way. So I met Jack Van Berg. I was 15 years old in New Orleans, running the streets there, not doing very well in school. So my uncle said, well, why don't you take him to the track, be a jockey? Because me and my brother was small. So I ended up at the track, and I got to working for Jack Van Berg and told him I wanted to be a jockey. And of course, Jack put you through the work, and he teach you how to work hard and do the right things.
Catalano's working relationship with Van Berg continued to flourish on and off the track. He learned the game from the ground up, riding exercise horses, and then competitively as a jockey for 9 years. Chronic knee injuries forced him out of the saddle and back on the ground, and he became a trainer on his own in 1983. Catalano shares a special connection with Jack Van Berg through his daughter, Shelby, who is married to jockey and Columbus, Nebraska native Channing Hill.
And my wife is actually Jack's goddaughter, so it's such a small world, So I've been like tied into the Van Berg family. I mean, since a little kid, my father rode for him. I mean, pretty much everybody that in this game rode for Jack. He was just kind of one of them guys.
Through the 1970s and early 80s, Jack Van Berg and his team of assistant trainers continued to manage various divisions of horses across the United States. And Jack's celebrity status in the sport of racing gained notoriety too.
When I graduated from college and went out and worked with him in California, it's almost like he became one of my best friends. And so I saw that side of him that I really did. And it wasn't the boss, it wasn't the manager, it wasn't the horseman, it wasn't the gruff, John Wayne type that most people see from him. And so to see my side of it is more of the loving father, the nurturer, to take his arm and put it around me and say, this is the way we do things, this is why we do things. And that's a side most people don't see from Jack.
Jack Van Berg was great. I first got in the business, and I always told Jack, you're in the wrong business. You should be John Wayne. I said, you've got the voice, and he'd say, well, get me in there. I said, well, you need an agent. I said, no, you get people, I'll get in there. But I really think he missed his calling. Not only was he just a great horseman and a horse trainer, but he actually could have made it in Hollywood because he had the voice, the charisma, he could tell a story. Nobody could tell a story better than Jack.
If the victories that Jack Van Berg put on the leaderboards in the 1970s weren't impressive enough, the records he would break in the 1980s propelled the Columbus, Nebraska kid to a whole new level of excellence. In June 1983, Jack Van Berg trained Gate Dancer, a dam-sire colt of Calumet Farms' foundational and North America's leading sire Bull Lee, to win his 2-year-old racing debut at Exarban Racetrack in Omaha, Nebraska. Even with all his pedigree and racing potential, Gate Dancer still posed a challenge that only an intuitive trainer like Jack Van Berg could solve. The fast-running, high-strung colt was notorious for becoming distressed from the sounds of the crowd noise, running with his head held high, zigzagging throughout his pace. Jack designed and devised a hood for Gate Dancer's head, with earmuffs to help minimize the noise. To match the Van Berg signature purple and gold silks, the new headgear for Gate Dancer would consist of a purple hood with a gold VB in the center. In 1984, Gate Dancer's points qualified him for a post in the 110th running of the Kentucky Derby, with odds of 19-1. However, the colt's bad racing habits were the only thing that prevailed on May 5th. Gate Dancer finished 4th behind Claiborne Farms' winning colt Swale, but was later disqualified back to 5th after an interference complaint was lodged against him. Gate Dancer became the first horse ever to be disqualified for interference in the history of the Kentucky Derby. Fortunately, Team Gate Dancer's luck improved 2 weeks later at the Preakness Stakes. Gate Dancer raced a straight path all the way to the winner's circle, dashing Swale's chance of becoming a Triple Crown winner like his sire, Seattle Slew. At age 47, Jack Van Berg had won his first American Classic. And later that year, Gate Dancer appeared in the inaugural running of the first Breeders' Cup Classic, the year-end racing event co-founded by Jack's fellow Nebraskan, John Nerud. In addition, Jack received the 1984 Eclipse Award for Outstanding Trainer. And like John Nerud and Jack's father Marion, Jack Van Berg would receive his own spot into the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame. As devastating as losing the Kentucky Derby on the first Saturday in May can be, what Jack Van Berg didn't know in March of 1984 was that a foal named Ali Sheba had just been born at the famous Hamburg Place in Lexington. Ali Sheba would provide Jack his next opportunity to run for the roses at Churchill Downs. Ironically, Ali Sheba was born in the same farm as America's first Triple Crown winner, Sir Barton. The historic 2,000-acre horse farm John Madden established as Hamburg Place in 1898 at Winchester Pike on the southeast side of Lexington is today one of the main arteries in Kentucky's horse country. All but a few acres have transformed into retail shopping, but the land has remained in the Madden family for 120 years. John Madden's grandson, Preston Madden, along with his late wife Anita and their son Patrick, decided to manage and direct the development of the Hamburg Place after Interstate 75 cut through the horse farm and housing began to creep nearer the farm's edges. Before the farm's breeding barns fully gave way to more roadways, Preston Madden had a dream to fulfill.
My grandfather was the country's leading breeder for 11 consecutive years. It was kind of an inherited tendency, but the other thing was I liked horses, and a natural projection of that was for me to want to breed horses, which the other thing was I did not inherit any horses except riding horses, steeplechase horses. So all the thoroughbred breeding stock that I had, I selected them myself. So my ambition in grade school, I told everyone that Preston Madden would breed a Kentucky Derby winner.
Born in 1934, 5 years after his grandfather's death, Preston Madden has always called Hamburg Place and Lexington his home. One of his favorite childhood memories includes when Will Harbit, the groom for the great champion Man o' War, placed him on top of the champion's back. It was decades earlier in the match race in 1920 that Man o' War beat the Hamburg Place homebred Sir Barton.
Well, I have innate affection for the thoroughbred. Family tradition inspired me to keep going. We aspire to raise the world's best horses, and I've been lucky enough to do that. It's an item of great luck to win the Kentucky Derby. There were 36 or 38,000 registered foals a year that Ali Sheba was registered. And out of 36 or 38,000 thoroughbreds, there's going to be one Kentucky Derby winner. So if you don't have to be an expert in probabilities to know that it takes luck, and I had it because I bred Ali Sheba, and I bred the dam of Ali Sheba, and I bred the granddam of Ali Sheba, and the great-grandsire of Ali Sheba stood at my farm. So it took me about 35 or 40 years to get around to breeding Ali Sheba, but good things come to those who persevere.
Ali Sheba inherited the championship traits that flowed through the Bay Colt's bloodline and his bluegrass birthplace decades earlier. Sired by Aladar, Ali Sheba was sold as a yearling to the Texas mother and daughter team of Dorothy and Pam Scarborough for $500,000. And Hall of Famer Jack Van Berg, who eyed Ali Sheba's potential at the sale, would be named his trainer.
When I first went to California, Jack was leading trainer in the country and leading all-time trainer, and his reputation spoke for itself. I was fortunate enough to be able to get on Ali Sheba before he ran in the Kentucky Derby, before anybody knew who Ali Sheba was. And Chris McCarron was his regular rider, and Chris had got injured, and I was stepping in for him to get him ready. And the first time I worked him, I remember I came back and I told Jack, I said, this horse will win the Kentucky Derby. He's the best thing that I've ever sat on. And I think Jack, he already knew what I'd felt. And of course, the rest is history.
At the 113th running of the Kentucky Derby, Ali Sheba drew the third post position with Chris McCarron in the irons. At the top of the stretch, Ali Sheba clipped heels with the leader, Bet Twice, and stumbled. Skilled Hall of Fame jockey McCarron avoided a near-fatal fall, passed Bet Twice, and aboard Ali Sheba, won first place by 3 parts of a length. With all eyes of the horse racing world on Kentucky that sunny Saturday afternoon, May 2nd, 1987, Ali Sheba had given the breeder Preston Madden, the jockey Chris McCarron, and the trainer Jack Van Berg of Van Berg Racing Stables, all 3 their first ever Kentucky Derby win. Under Van Berg's direction, Ali Sheba would win the 1987 Preakness Stakes, but fall short of winning the Triple Crown by coming in 4th place in the Belmont Stakes. With the Triple Crown races behind him, Jack Van Berg would press on to reach other industry milestones. On July 15, 1987, in the 9th race at Arlington Park, Jack Van Berg became the first trainer in North American racing history to record 5,000 wins. Ali Sheba would continue his racing success as a 4-year-old. After winning the 1988 Breeders' Cup Classic, he retired as the richest thoroughbred winner of all time and named Horse of the Year. In the high plains of Nebraska, men became great horsemen and learned the work ethic that would carry them throughout their lives.
Yeah, I don't think you ever prepared for, for something, like your father's death, but there were so many more unanswered questions that I thought of after his passing that I would have liked to ask why he was still here.
But he was great to work for. He was always great to his help. There might be a guy standing at the front gate or walking down the street wanting, begging for money or whatever, and Jack said, I won't just give you money. He says, but I got a job for you at the racetrack if you'd like to come work. And that's just the kind of man that Jack Van Berg was.
An untold number of people that Jack has fed into their lives, helped them, assisted them, that are carrying the ball. And that's what we should all endeavor to do. Pay it forward, if you would. Help, assist, encourage one another along in this thing called the race of life. He talked at length about the influence that his father instilling a work ethic, a man of integrity. Talked about the stockyards to start with, being an auctioneer, and certainly the racing. And I could sit for hours and listen to him share stories about his childhood growing up, and obviously his father was a pretty tough man, but a great horseman. I heard wonderful stories about Marion, his eye for a horse and remembering horses.
After they finished up and everything was all done up in the stable, then they'd sit down and play cards. He'd play with how many trainers, big shots would sit down with the help and play cards. Not too many.
I have always judged people by the way that they treat their family and the family holds them. And there's no question that in those standards, John Nerud was a giant. I think he was immensely proud of the progress that he made from being a quiet country farm boy to being the celebrity that he was. He never practiced being a celebrity, but he understood that that's what he was. And as such, I think that the roots and the qualities and the genuineness of his upbringing shone through. And towards his later years, he became increasingly more proud of what Nebraska meant for him and his family.
Mr. Nerud was one of the finest trainers in New York and anywhere with a horse. He never got to win the Triple Crown, but he was a Triple Crown trainer.
Triple Crown.
Well, we'll miss him forever.
Oh,
As the 20th century unfolded, the bloodlines of America's finest champion horses would help build the U.S. Army's remount service program. In the far northwest corner of Nebraska's Panhandle, great horses were being raised and trained to help the nation's efforts to rebuild the military's cavalry and artillery mounts. The largest of the remount centers was established in 1919 at Fort Robinson, near Crawford, Nebraska. Built during the Indian Wars, Fort Robinson was revamped to become a remount center. An estimated 10,000 horses passed through Fort Robinson between 1919 and 1931. Among those would be America's first Triple Crown winner, Sir Barton. After retiring from racing, Sir Barton's breeder, John Madden of Hamburg Place, would partner with the Jones brothers of Audley Farm in Virginia as an investor and a thoroughbred industry mentor. In 1921, the partnership purchased Sir Barton from its owner J.K.L. Ross to become the foundation sire for the farm. Sir Barton stood stud in Virginia from 1921 to 1927, and his offspring achieved modest success. By 1928, Audley Farms' B.B. Jones sold Sir Barton to the U.S. Army Remount Service Headquarters Station at Front Royal, Virginia. But Sir Barton remained on the farm through the 1932 breeding season. After World War I, the U.S. Army Remount Service was created to ensure the existence of ideal cavalry horses in the United States. Some have speculated why Jones would sell Sir Barton to the Remount Service program. Perhaps Jones was influenced by his friend and mentor, John Madden, who was not only the breeder of the famed Triple Crown winner, but had written an essay for the Thoroughbred Record in 1913, 3 years before Sir Barton was foaled at Hamburg Place. Within the essay entitled The Army Remount and Artillery Horse, Madden wrote that the thoroughbred horse was unsurpassed in fearlessness and intelligence, valuable traits to transmit to progeny intended for service in battle. From Front Royal, Virginia, Sir Barton was eventually sold to Dr. Joseph Hilton of Douglas, Wyoming in 1933, and was loaned to the U.S. Remount Service Depot at Fort Robinson near Crawford, Nebraska.
The remount program started right after World War I. The fort never became a training ground during the war from 1917 to 1918 with U.S. involvement. They are reevaluating military installations. Which ones should they keep open? Which should they close? And they decided that this location for Fort Robinson was a pretty good fit. Well, the limelight always goes back east, right, with the horse racing. And so to say, hey, it's a really fun fact that Fort Robinson, that the first Triple Crown winner came out of here.
Sir Barton lived out his last days on Dr. Hilton's ranch in the foothills of the Laramie Mountains until he died of colic on October 30th, 1937, at the age of 21. And was buried near his paddock with a simple sandstone marker.
To order your own Born to Rein DVD, commemorative guide, or movie poster, visit borntorein.com or call 844-585-1299. Mail checks or money orders to American Doorstop Project Productions at this address.